Welcome to Telstar for this screening of the film DawnLand. I'd like to begin by introducing one of our panelists, Dr. Mishi Lesser. She's the co-founder of the Upstander Project, learning director of DawnLand, and education fellow at the Thomas J. Dodd Research Center at the University of Connecticut. She's the director of the Upstander Academy, a week-long professional learning experience for teachers and museum educators that focuses on genocide and decolonization and the skills of upstanders. Currently, Dr. Lesser spends much of her time researching and writing the 3 Inquiry Teacher's Guide for DawnLand. Mishi authored the Coexist Teacher's Guide to promote learning about the complexity of reconciliation in post-genocide Rwanda. She is a circle keeper, and she has been featured on WBUR Boston and PRI BBC's The World. Mishi was a Fulbright scholar in Ecuador and spent 12 years learning and working in the Andes. Welcome, Mishi.
Thank you so much, Melissa. You and others in this room have worked tirelessly to bring us here, and we're very grateful for everybody's efforts. It's an honor and a privilege for me to be with teachers and community members from near and far this evening, and I thank you so much for coming out to see DawnLand. I have a bit of laryngitis, so I'm going to be doing my best. I hope I don't get into any difficulty with my voice. The film you're about to watch, DawnLand, looks at the first government-sanctioned Truth and Reconciliation Commission in United States history, focused on issues of importance to Indigenous peoples. The commission in Maine examines forced removal and coerced assimilation of Native children, which has been happening across the centuries in the United States, and most recently through state child welfare systems. All over the country, Native children are taken away from their families and communities to be adopted or placed with foster families. Please note my use of the present tense. This is still happening. The forced removal of Native children is part of settler colonialism, a system in which settlers occupy someone else's land and try to erase its original inhabitants from the physical and the social landscape. This process of erasure is made more enduring if children are taken away and raised by members of the dominant culture, who often, not always, but often, teach them to disavow their origins and suppress their heritage. This, according to the United Nations Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide, meets the criteria of genocide. It's explicitly mentioned in Article 2, Clause E of the Convention. The film is also about something that is perhaps uncomfortable for some to hear. It's about the origins of white supremacy in this place now called Maine and in this region now called New England. I did not understand that when I began work on this project 6 years ago in Boston, nor did I understand that I am a settler, a trespasser, an uninvited guest on Native land. Now aware of that, I want to acknowledge those who dwelled here before us and those who dwell here today, keeping in mind that we are gathered in the homeland of the Wabanaki and Abenaki peoples, where human beings have lived for over 13,000 years. And I just want to let that sink in for a moment, because I had to really do the math, like how many generations is that? It's over 500 generations. That's a lot of culture, a lot of knowledge, a lot of experience passed from generation to generation. Finally, a word of caution. This film packs a very powerful emotional punch. Please take care of yourself when watching it. Especially say that if you are someone who has been fostered, or if you have been a foster parent, or if you were adopted, or were an adopting parent, or if you are an Indigenous person, this film may have a very personal impact on you. So please take care of yourself. I also want to acknowledge that I feel very grateful to be on a panel after the screening of DawnLand with Esther Ann, who is the co-founder of Maine Wabanaki Reach, and I know she doesn't like it when I say that I consider her to be a godmother of this entire process of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, but according to what I've come to learn, I think that is a fair statement. And with April Fournier, whose personal experiences as an educator, as an Indigenous woman, as a member of nearby communities will bring enormous relevancy to our conversation. You're about to see the 86-minute version of DawnLand. In spite of what was advertised, we decided that it's better if we show you the entire film, not the shorter version that was aired on PBS last year. So the last thing I want to share with you is that DawnLand begins very quietly in the halls of the United States Senate. The year is 1974. There's a Senate hearing. You will see Indigenous women telling their stories, which led to a groundbreaking new law, the Indian Child Welfare Act of 1978, which was signed by President Carter. 20 years after passage of that law, here in the state of Maine, another group of mostly women, survivors of forced removal and social workers and leaders of their community, Wabanaki women and non-Native women, organized themselves and asserted themselves to create a Truth and Reconciliation Commission to address harms caused by a child welfare system that takes Wabanaki children because it deems white culture superior. With that, I'd leave you with DawnLand, and we look forward to the conversation after the film ends.
All right, we're going to move to our panel discussion. But before we do so, I'd like to say a few thank yous to some folks who were really instrumental in bringing this event to us. So we'd like to recognize first our fiscal sponsors, which include Mahoosic Land Trust, West Parish Congregational Church, Norway Savings Bank, Brendan Bass, Museums of the Bethel Historical Society, Foothills Florin, CORE, Inspiring Community, formerly Bank, DeCoco's Bakery and Cafe, Pooh Corner Farm, and the Bethel Inn and Resort. Beyond our fiscal sponsors, there's many people who contributed their time and energy to planning this screening, and I'd like to take a moment to thank them for their contributions. First, to my fellow planning team members who worked tirelessly for many months to organize this event. Barbara Murphy, Development Director at the Mahoosic Land Trust. Raise your hand. Brendan Bass, who is an MS 44 community member and West Parish Congregational Church parishioner. Brendan Schaffler, Network Facilitator, Oxford County Wellness Collaborative, Oxford County Resiliency Project, and father of a TMS 7th grade student. Jenny Smith, TMHS Social Worker, OCMHS Behavioral Health Liaison, and Telstar Resiliency Team. Jenny. And I'm Melissa Prescott. I'm the visual art teacher, and I'm also a member of the Telstar Resiliency Team. And I'm proud to have the privilege of helping to organize such a wonderful group of people. Our team was also supported by the efforts and input of other Telstar staff, including Jim Cobb, TMS 7th grade social studies teacher. Hi, Jim. Lindsay Lecce, TMS Dean of Students. Mark Kenny, TMHS Principal. Cheryl Lang, MS 8044 Curriculum Director. James Haynes, Telstar Technology Lead. And Duncan McFarland, TMS Music Teacher. Special thanks to Brooks Morton and WHAT-TV for recording the event. Thanks to Wade Kavanaugh and Sarah Southam from the GEM Theater for helping us to connect, helping the members of our planning team to meet each other as we all recognized we wanted to bring a screening to the area so we could collaborate together. Thanks to Jesse Perkins from the Bethel Chamber of Commerce and Sam Wheeler and Allison Aloiso at the Bethel Citizen for helping us spread the word about the event. And at the conclusion of this event, the organizers would like you to know that we'd like to help continue this conversation in the future and help facilitate efforts to promote equity, diversity, and inclusion in our community. If you'd like to stay informed about any future opportunities for community dialogue and collaboration around these topics, we have a sign-up sheet on the table where you can leave us your name and address, and we'll keep you informed. And if you'd like to document your participation for CU purposes, we will have certificates available at the end. Because we show the longer version, we are ready to stay past 7:30. The majority of the time between now and 7:30 will be panel discussion with some prepared questions. And at the end, if folks want to hang around more for questions and answers, we're all available to hang around a little bit later than 7:30. So I've already introduced you to Mishi Lesser, and I'd like to introduce you to our other two panelists. Esther Ann, who you met very extensively in the film. She's Passamaquoddy from Zibayak. She joined the Muskie School of Public Service in 2003, where she works on projects that engage and benefit tribal communities, including facilitating the Maine Tribal State Indian Child Welfare Act work group and creating child welfare resources with the Capacity Building Center for Tribes. She had a primary role in the creation and establishment of the Maine Wabanaki State Child Welfare Truth and Reconciliation Commission and Maine Wabanaki REACH. Esther now serves as the secretary for the REACH Board of Directors and the Fundraising Development Committee. And April Fournier, Dine Navajo, is the mother of 4 children, one who has an autism diagnosis. She has extensive experience and a master's degree in special education, and she has been specializing in early education. She is currently the Operations and Special Services Manager at Promise Early Education Center in Lewiston, Maine, where she's responsible for leading a team of educators to implement culturally sensitive and trauma-informed practices with children and their families. As a child, April's mother was removed from the home of her birth family and tribal community. Only as an adult was she able to reconnect with her tribe and its traditions. April is also a co-founder of Team Indigenous Roller Derby, a team of roller derby athletes representing diverse Indigenous groups from around the world. They recently competed at the Roller Derby World Cup. Thank you. I'm asking the questions. So, the first question we're going to ask folks to respond to here, each of them will have a minute or two to respond, is what's your connection to this film and why are you passionate about it? Oh, sorry, it's muted.
These are teachers' voices.
I mean, I can project, but.
Yeah. Sorry.
Is it unmuted yet?
It will be.
Okay.
Special thanks to my husband Mike for unmuting.
Hello. Oh, there. Great. All right. Hi, guys. So my name is April Fournier. I am Dine, which is the Navajo tribe of the Southwest. My clan is the Onakani clan. We are the mountain lion of the cougar. I am so passionate about this film because it's very personal for me. My mother was removed from the Navajo reservation when she was 4 years old with her infant sister, and they were adopted out to white parents in Southern California. And so they grew up learning English away from their culture, away from their relations, and they are one of the few success stories where the family they grew up with was very supportive, very loving, and did the best they could at raising 2 Navajo girls. It did not replace the cultural ties or the legacies and traditions that come with growing up within your own community. So there was always a sense of loss and grieving that my mother really just couldn't replace. And in 1993, she happened to be living in Maine. My dad is from Maine, and was flipping through a magazine at her doctor's office, and it was a magazine from the Southwest, and happened to see a city councilor from Flagstaff who looked remarkably like her, almost a twin, and she just felt this instant connection, like, I swear I think I know this person. And so she reached out A few years later, it took a little while to overcome the fear of what if I reach out and this is not a person I know. And so she reached out to the Flagstaff City Council to find out more about him. They gave her his phone number. She called and said her birth name, Lorraine Virgie Wood, and they both started crying. Sorry. But they were able to reconnect, and they found each other after 33 years of being apart. And so if you lived here in Maine in the early 90s, they actually covered it on, I think, Channel 6 and Channel 13. There was a really neat little story that they followed them as he got off the airplane and ran up with balloons and presents and hugged his sisters for the very first time in 33 years. And so we've been able to since reconnect with that side of the family. We lived actually in the Southwest for a while. My oldest son was born in Albuquerque. And I'm so proud to now know and really represent and learn so much more about my culture so that I can teach my children, I have 4 children, about their culture so that they can then teach their children about their culture. So this, to me, is just such an incredible project and just one step in making the story known so that more communities can take these same steps.
Deliveries Esteran, Chkovanakik, Estromogainil, Nujeyu Zibayik, Nudebe Zibayik, Wigubanotskawi. My name is Esther Ann. I'm Chkovanakik, people of the land when the sun first looks their way. Oh my goodness. And I am Passamaquoddy, people who spear Pollock. I'm from Zibayik, where my family's from, and I live with Penobscot, the place of the White Rocks, the Penobscot people. And I think you know my connection to the film, right? I just saw the film. But when, that question about what brings you here, or why are you doing this, or why are you passionate about that, comes up a lot. And I think a lot of Native people that are involved in this work would tell you that they don't feel like they have a choice. It's not really, like, we don't really have the luxury of saying, okay, what do we want to be when we grow up? A lot of it is predetermined that what we're going to do is try to work as hard as we can to preserve our people, to ensure the continued existence of our people. That kind of becomes our goal, and that's manifested in a lot of different ways. And I really became aware of that in this work back in 1999 when the tribes in the state first got together, when I started listening to the non-Native people around the table, the white people, and them talking about what brought them to this work. And it was such a difference. And in some ways, they were at a disadvantage in this process in the beginning because since this was for the Native people, since this is our lives, we were able to bring our whole selves around that table. And for those non-Native people, they weren't able to do that. So we had to really work hard to create the space for them to be able to bring their whole selves into the process. And that's when it started really propelling. But that's all I'll say for now, and let Michie answer that question.
A little over 10 years ago, my colleague Adam Mazo and I, he's a documentary filmmaker, we created in Boston an organization called Upstander Project. Our first film was about post-genocide Rwanda, and I wrote a teacher's guide to accompany that film and spent about 4 years working in lots of elementary, but especially middle and high schools, also at the college level, teaching about colonialism and the ways in which it contributed to what became genocide in Rwanda and the reality of that post-genocide society. And as we were deep into that work, I started to feel morally very uncomfortable. I've never been to Rwanda. It's a good teacher's guide that I wrote. I read many other people's books to write it. But who was I to be teaching about genocide in a faraway place, especially if I wasn't, in my work, addressing genocide in the history of this country, which is my country, where my ancestors were given refuge a few generations ago. And I put a prayer out to the universe. There were discussion questions in the teacher's guide about Rwanda, trying to get teachers and students to think about genocide in the history of this country. But it was just a few discussion questions and suggestions of research projects, didn't go beyond that. And my prayer to the universe was, I want us to focus on genocide in the history of this land. And I feel like the prayer was answered when I had Boston Public Radio on almost a half years ago. And there was a little piece from Maine Public Broadcasting announcing the creation of the Maine Wabanaki State Child Welfare Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And that was it. That was it for us. And then there was a process, which maybe we'll talk about later or not. But that was the inspiration and the prayer.
Hello? All right, this is so we're going to start with some questions. First for Maria.
Esther.
Excuse me. And
Yeah, did you explain
I
that?
didn't explain that. We're so sorry. So Maria had a...
Yeah, Maria was scheduled to be here. Maria Gerard, she's Penobscot. She's the executive director of REACH. She was scheduled to be here, but she had a family emergency, couldn't be here, so I'm trying to sub in for her. It's really big shoes to fill. Maria's a tribal historian, and just so talented, and so I'm going to do my best.
Okay, so our first question for Esther Ann, and after she answers, you guys feel free to chime in. What has been the impact of the TRC on Maine's child welfare system, and how have things changed?
So, one of the recommendations that the commission handed down was to re-establish that original tribal state equal work group that started in 1999, that started this whole process. And so in the state of Maine, that work group is facilitated by me. I facilitate that. I work for the Muskie School. I'll try to explain this because it can get confusing. But I work for the Muskie School of Public Service, and we have a contract with the state of Maine to provide all kinds of services, a lot of them around foster care, young people in foster care. And one of the services that we provide is for me to facilitate this work group. Prior to the TRC, it was at like 10% of my time. The state upped that commitment to 25%, even before the recommendations came out. That there was a different director at the time, but he really believed in the power of this collaborative work. So since August of 2015, that group has reestablished, and if you look at the Truth Commission's recommendations, there's some available out on the table. There's 14, and 7 of them are real specific to child welfare. So we took those 7 recommendations as sort of like the basis of our work plan, what we're going to do. And we've been doing a lot of wonderful work. Now, what you have to understand about the state of Maine, when we got together in 1999, the tribes in the state, that doesn't happen hardly anywhere else in this country. And so there's a saying, as Maine goes, so goes the nation. It really is true with child welfare. Getting those child welfare workers to sit at the same table with tribal child welfare workers was really an accomplishment, and the things that we have done since then really deserve some attention and some praise. So one of the things that that we did was create real solid child welfare policy together. It's the Indian Child Welfare Policy, and one of the things that it does is it asks caseworkers not to just follow the letter of the law, but to really go and understand and uphold the spirit of the law. So they treat, there's a lot of technical things that I won't get into, but they treat those cases, those ICWA cases, right, the New Child Welfare Act cases, there's one standard, the standard of helping families, like when caseworkers are helping families to do their plans and do what they need to do, they have to make reasonable efforts. For ICWA cases, they have to make active efforts. This is new regulations that came down from the federal government in 2016. So the state of Maine has taken that standard of active efforts and is asking caseworkers to apply that to all of their cases. Because again, the New Child Welfare Act is regarded as the gold standard in child welfare policy. And another example of child welfare practice has been impacted by tribal practice is kinship care. 30 years ago, they would never place a child with the grandmother. The apple doesn't fall far from the tree, right? And because of practice in tribal communities with extended families, and now we have kinship care, where children are able to stay with their families when they're taken. So it's really impacted, we were doing a lot of this work prior to the TRC that helped us create that Truth Commission, and those recommendations from the Commission have really validated our work and given us a little bit more direction. But I can't even tell you, it's just a wonderful group. We have full representation from the State Department of Human Services. We have 2 folks on there from the Attorney General's office. We have 2 folks on there from the Maine court system. We have representatives from all the tribal communities. And we have a young person who's a former youth in care that's on our work group. And one of the things that was a priority when we first reassembled was there's ICWA outlines this qualified expert ICWA witness that you need to have in ICWA cases, and it's so technical, you guys, but anyway, we are training tribal members to be those qualified expert witnesses. We're really pushing within our tribal communities, to move the responsibility for protecting children back into the middle of the community where it belongs, and not this total colonial method of it's a department over here of 2 or 3 people and they're responsible for protecting children. No, we're all responsible for protecting children. And this, that it's timely that I'm making the statement because there are some children that need our protecting, not just in the state of Maine, but down on the southern border. It's all our responsibility. So we're trying to, in our tribal communities, trying to give more education about ICWA and child welfare, really trying to give tribal people different opportunities to participate in that, be part of that circle of protection. So qualified expert witnesses, foster parents, resource parents we call them, respite care providers. And one of the things that has been getting more successful is having people in our tribal communities at our tribal gatherings act as community hosts for non-Native people who have Native children in foster care off the reservation so they can bring them into the community. Because it's intimidated. When these resource parents take Native children, they sign contracts saying, I will bring them to X number of cultural events, I will bring them to the community, I'll keep them involved. But it's hard when they don't have anybody to guide them. So that's been something that's been successful too. I could probably go on for another half hour, but I can't. So, do you want? Is it your next question, or did you want these guys to weigh in on that? You probably can.
If you want to add anything to that.
I think it goes next.
The only thing I would add is, so as Melissa said, I work for Promise Early Education Center in Lewiston, which is actually, it's the Androscoggin Head Start. So if you guys don't know much about Head Start, it's really, a federal program that's designed to serve families in poverty, to make sure that children have everything that they need to get ready for school. So that's, safe housing, that's, food in their bellies, that's parents who can provide sustainable income to keep that house afloat, and that's a safe place to learn. So one of the things that we do frequently get in the Head Start world is children who are in foster care. And so it is really on my radar as an early childhood educator to make sure that we're looking at these kiddos from that whole family lens. So not only the foster family, but if their birth family is also involved, how can we keep everybody connected so that they're all part of this child's life. What we know about early childhood trauma is if it's not addressed, if it's not supported, then it leads to later issues where, whether it's an elementary student who has anger issues or a middle schooler who, is getting into fights or refusing to go to school, or, high schoolers that end up incarcerated in places like Long Creek because they haven't had the support along the way. So I think learning more about your local agencies that support these children is, just a critical piece to making sure that, when children are removed from their families, they still have a community that they can belong to.
Okay, so the next question is for April. Why do you think it's important for teachers to make the connection between historical and intergenerational trauma and trauma-informed schools?
Great question. So I think I'll start with the story. I think sometimes we think this unintentional racism happens, or that happened a long time ago and it's not happening as much today. So I will just share a story that this year my daughter came home from school one day and was very upset. And so I asked her, what's going on? And so she said, well, we're studying the French and Indian War. And so we were doing a play in the classroom, and my line in the play was, oh no, aren't the Native Americans dangerous? And I was like, oh gosh, well, what did you do? And she said, well, I told my teacher, I'm Native American, I don't want to say that. And her teacher still had her say the line. And this, this is in Portland schools, and so I think we're progressive, and I think we've kind of moved the needle. And there are places where it still pops up, and we haven't moved the needle, and we haven't thought about these things that we're asking all of our children to do, whether we know that they are Indigenous or not. And so, my daughter is a mini-me, I like to say, and she is very vocal. She's on the civil rights team for her school. She's a little social justice warrior, and she's in 5th grade, but she is already an advocate for herself to say, this isn't okay, I don't want to do it, this isn't right. But then you think about all of the other children who haven't found that voice yet, especially those who haven't had the opportunity to grow up in their community. So I think having events like this where we're able to invite the community in to just learn about what's happened in our past, to really be able to hear people's truth, that then can translate into changes in our educational curriculums, that can translate into changes in our teaching practices, so that when we are talking to children about things like Columbus Day, which I think you, State of Maine, may have changed that to Indigenous Peoples Day. You can applaud for that. And also talking about, the origins of Thanksgiving and how, this country was invaded by people from England who were seeking a different place, but it's not all turkeys and pilgrim hats. There were people who were already here, and it wasn't the best relationship that they started out with. So let's, start to talk about those truths rather than let's color turkeys and have a little Thanksgiving Day parade. So I think it's, if we want to help replace and remove some of that trauma for our children going forward, it's going to take a real effort by all of us. And it's from, when the state is asking for input on curriculum, it's actually making sure that the state and school districts meet their mandate for teaching Wabanaki studies. It's actually in state law that it's supposed to happen. It doesn't always happen. So I think it's all of our job to make sure that these things happen, so that we have schools that are supportive of all of our students. Yeah.
Can I segue into the question you wanted to pose for me?
Sure.
Because I think you teed me up beautifully.
That's what I was thinking.
Did you want to pose that question?
Sure. Your question, Mishi, is how do you recommend teaching this story, and what resources are available to teachers to do so?
So, as the educator at the Upstander Project, my job is to develop curricula that accompany our films. So this is the first inquiry of the DawnLand Teacher's Guide. There will be 2 others. This one contains 12 lessons. I have vowed that the future ones will only be 2 or 3 lessons at most. This document, in some ways, was my response to my own ignorance and the fact that I was raised by teachers who only knew one version of the history of our country. It's what Gisa Tanamuk, who you met in the film, refers to as the view from the boat. So my teachers only knew the view from the boat, and I grew up thinking that that was truth. And my commitment, my vow in this work is to try to get this tool into the hands of as many middle and high school teachers as possible across the land. And while people who maybe live in the Southwest won't relate to the view from the boat, the view from the shore as much as those of us in this region, I'm finding that people get it. And so my commitment is to bring the voices of the people on the shore into the classroom. And so this document with its 12 lessons is full of primary sources of different kinds, because not everything that's been written is truth. There are many voices that need to be represented, not just through historic documents, but there are also historic documents that most of us didn't grow up knowing. So I'll just do a very quick show of hands. How many people in this room have read The Diary of Anne Frank or heard of it? How many people in this room have heard of The Midnight Ride of Paul Revere? And how many people in this room know about the Phips Bounty Proclamation signed on November 5th of 1755? Woohoo! Wow! I'm so impressed that there are some people who raised your hands. My goal is that there'll be a day where everybody will raise their hand, because we have succeeded in teaching about the history of genocide and the origins of our country and in these territories. The entire Dawnland teaching enterprise, all 3 inquiries, is guided by a single compelling question. And I would contend that if teachers use this tool with students, at the end, watching the film, working with the activities in each of the lessons, they will be able to develop an argument that answers that question. And it is, what is the relationship between the taking of the land and the taking of the children? And that question came to me a couple of years into the research. This is the product of 5 years of research, and a couple of years into it, that question hit me on the side of my head like a 2x4. So that's my answer.
Okay, so I borrowed this language from the viewer's guide, which there are several examples of in the hallway. So we're going to move into question and answer period. And the primary goal of Dawnland is for viewers to have a conversation that's based on listening and accountability. Feelings of shame or guilt, particularly from non-native audience members, may come up, and these feelings can sometimes overwhelm the conversation. If you're planning to participate in the following discussion and are non-native, we encourage you to listen to the experiences of Indigenous people. We ask that you follow these guidelines for the discussion. Speak from your own personal experience and use I statements to prevent overgeneralizing your individual experience. For example, my experience has taught me that, instead of we all know that. Refrain from interruptions or backtalk in response to someone else's sharing of their experience, and be mindful to share the airtime and not dominate the conversation. I will come around with a mic for anybody that wants to ask a question. You can direct it to the general panel or individuals. Would anybody like to ask a question?
The last rule is everybody has to have a question.
No.
Since no one else will say anything, I'm still wondering about the reconciliation idea, the word. I would love to hear from your spending so much time and thought with this. Where are you with the reconciliation part at this point?
All of us, okay. I can start. So yeah, that word reconciliation became real problematic. I'm sure you saw in the film. And we have since done some, we've had a lot of conversations in REACH, our core group, and we have decided to change the R to restoration, away from reconciliation. Because reconciliation can just be understood in so many different ways. It means different things to different people. And what I was thinking it meant was not what a lot of other people were thinking it meant. It seemed like too much of an out, an easy out. It was too seductive, for people to just go to the happiness and it happens with Native people a lot. And folks are really gravitate to the lovely knowledge. My dear friend Rebecca Sockbeeson, who's a professor at the University of Alberta, introduced me to this concept. She didn't invent it. It's written by another Native Indigenous scholar whose name escapes me. But she talks about the lovely knowledge and the difficult knowledge, and how it's real easy to gravitate to the lovely knowledge. The feathers, the bees. We were talking about how we, teach about history, and it's hard to grapple with the difficult knowledge. So that reconciliation really, it became a problem because it gave people that way around that, and so really, and it's really not our goal. I don't think it's our goal anymore. I think in doing this work, we do a lot of work with restorative practices and restorative justice. We got into this through the Truth Commission because we wanted to make sure that our incarcerated relatives had an opportunity to share their story with the Truth Commission, because we know there's quite a straight pipeline from child welfare to prison, right, for a lot of folks, not just Native folks. So that brought us into the prisons, and now, all these years later, we're still doing healing circles with the Native inmates in the prisons, and really our work that really just opened us up to this concept of restoration and repairing harm, and restoring ourselves and our communities and our hearts and our minds and our souls, right? It's about restoring, because reconciliation is, that somebody had said early on in the Truth Commission, I know the commissioners grappled with that word reconciliation, and they're like, okay, to reconcile, like you balance it all out, you make it the way it was, and they were like, but it was never balanced in the first place. Like you can't balance something that was already in balance. So for us, it's about restoration, and it really is more descriptive of our work. We do restorative work in tribal communities. The work we do in Maine communities in educating people, we're giving them some tools so they can begin that restorative work. It's like holding up a mirror. It's not some frustrating dynamic that I have seen. Native people have been marginalized and our voices have been repressed for so long, and now we're getting some attention. But it's turning into that lovely knowledge. That's what people want to know about, and sometimes it gets real frustrating because it's not, even with the whole change of Indigenous Peoples Day, that is something, or the mascots, that's something that it should not, it's not our work, that's your work. That Columbus, that whole statue, that whole thing, that was not our doing. It's good. It's a good gesture, it's a good start, but it's not a box you can check and just say this is done and our work's done. And to always look for, people ask me questions, well, how, they want me to do their thinking for them, make my decision, tell me what to do, like, how should I feel, how should I think? And that's not what this is about. It's about everybody figuring that out for themselves, everybody figuring out what kind of person we want to be from here on, with the knowledge that we have as we learn more about what we learn, how do we want to be? Who do we want to be in this world? How are we going to, what kind of person are we going to be? And it's not for me to tell you what to do. It's for everybody to look into their own selves and restore that within yourself, right? So it's not easy work. Nobody can get out of this easy. It's hard work. It's hard for Native people, and it's hard for non-Native people, and it's work that we need at some time. Like I said in the film, so at some point we have to be by ourselves to do that before we can come together. Of course, the goal is always for us to figure out how we can be good neighbors or be in mutual respect. But, sometimes we have to be on our own to do that. Anyway, I'll just keep rambling. Yeah, thank you.
I think Kisatanomok speaks to us from the movie in ways that are helpful to this question that we're talking about. There's a scene that you saw where he's referring to a necessary transition. He's talking about the Truth Commission, but he could also be talking about those of us who are non-Native. He talks about a necessary transition from being occupiers to neighbors with legitimacy. And personally, I think there's something prophetic in his formulation. I've participated in hundreds of Dawland screenings in a variety of communities and states and settings. And I was at a screening not long ago in Massachusetts, in Western Massachusetts, in a very progressive community. And someone raised a question, it's like, what would it take for us to have a statewide Truth Commission here in Massachusetts? And I was a little horrified because I've heard Esther Ann and Penthea and the creators of Maine Wabanaki Reach talk about the years of organizing and research and effort that they have made to create conditions for a Truth Commission to have existed here and then to take that work forward. And one thing Esther Ann didn't mention is that they are invited all over the country to share what they are learning about reforming a state child welfare system. They're not just leading here in Maine, they're leading elsewhere. But you don't just convene a Truth Commission. Local communities such as yours need to wrestle with Kisatanomok's question, as each of us have to. I've wrestled with that question for myself as an educator by pouring my efforts into research and engaging with teachers. And I know there are social studies teachers here in the room, and I would love to come back to your middle and your high school to engage with you and through you with your students. But it's the grassroots community by community conversation that would build conditions. And you all have to figure out, as Esther Ann was suggesting, as a community, what would it mean for you to become neighbors with legitimacy in relationship with the Native peoples upon whose land you live and study and work and raise your families? And only you together can answer that question. Nobody can answer it for you. So that's what I think, Kisatanomok refers to as the law, or you talk about way beyond me. And he talks about the long road. You both use different words to refer to this reality.
Actually, you guys covered it. I'm just going to say that we're going to try to have a hard stop at 8, and we totally understand if folks had planned on leaving at 7:30 if you need to go. So just be aware it's not room to leave if you need to. I'm going to bring the mic over here. So next week here in Bethel, we have Molly Alcate. And I grew up here in Bethel, and I'm non-native. And I grew up wanting to be Miss Molly Alcate. I had long brown hair, and I watched 15 years of women in my community walk down these streets. And I left this area, and I lived in northern Maine for 7 years, and I stayed with friends on tribal land, and I have strong relationships with community members from both Mi'kmaq and Maliseet tribes, and I don't know. I know last year there was an incident during our parade where someone was attempting to, I don't know what the word I'm trying to find is, but someone was trying to represent Miss Molly Alcate in the parade, and I know that myself and a lot of other people found that to be a misrepresentation, and I guess what I'm asking for now is not from necessarily you folks, but more from everyone else who's in this room for next week. How are we going to, as a community, make sure that everybody knows? Because I don't see a lot of the people who were defending that float last year here tonight. So what do we do to let them know that they need to look at what they're doing? And I don't know, like I think we need a community conversation about the harm that we do with these parades and with these half-truths of our history where, like, I'm non-native and I wasn't born here, so I don't have as many people in my family who want to try and tell me that, oh, your great-grandmother was a Native American princess. I'm sure you guys have all heard that before. But there are a lot of people in this community who do have that ancestral connection, and I want to reach out to the people in this room to see what we're all going to do to make sure that we create those bridges, because like you guys have said, it's not up to you. So what are we going to do? I think I can speak to that very briefly in that the names and emails we're collecting are intended to keep this conversation going. As somebody who feels much like you do, I feel that I have a responsibility as an educator in this district to start these conversations when I recognize that they're not happening. And so know that I personally will make sure that this conversation continues and the folks whose names are on that list have a chance to meet again and talk exactly about that and do our work.
No, I just wondered, do they still do the essay contest?
Nobody reads it.
Okay, because I know that.
Nobody reads it, nobody acknowledges it. I didn't see last year's parade, I didn't see the essay winners. They may have been there, but if they were, there was no.
Not as much excitement around that as there was in the past when it was the, yeah.
I actually emailed the Molly Alcate Day committee today, as a matter of fact, asking about the essay contest. And they said that because they didn't have enough entrants in the past, they had decided to forego that this year and that they were no longer doing it. So I guess that is the answer to that question for this year at least. But following up on that, I almost wonder too, even though there's only 1 week from right now, is there a potential that some of us could band together and say create our own committee in the parade and distribute information about REACH or other resources and start a community conversation? If not, I don't know if you've thought about that. It's really short timing, but if some people were willing to do that, I will walk and pass out things in the parade. I don't know if anybody else, if that's something that people have been planning or what.
So the only thing I would say is, similar to what we've kind of already said, is it's a long game, right? So it's not, I know this just happens to be next week, but if you think about just some of the other changes that we've had in the state just recently this year, the banning of the native mascots, the change to Indigenous Peoples Day, those are conversations that have been going for years, and there have been countless committees and school board meetings and city council meetings and hours and hours and hours and hours, years and years really, of energy and effort by both the native and non-native allies trying to get these things changed. So I think the important thing to recognize is having events like this, having conversations like this where we're just starting to discover, oh gosh, there are other people in this community just like me who think that this isn't right and this isn't okay. So now I've made a connection, and just like it is walking, if you were a foster parent, a non-native foster parent with a native child, and you're trying to go to your first gathering with this child, if you don't have anyone in the room who you have a connection to, it's really hard to walk through that door. So I think if you guys look around this room right now, there is a whole bunch of people that are going to walk through that door with you. And it's just so important to keep those connections, keep the conversation going. I'm just really, really excited to see so many people here, but these are your community members that will take that first step with you.
Thank you. Is there anybody else? Yeah.
So in my family, it's kind of, it's known, but it's not very often spoken about. My grandmother was adopted as an infant, and my grandfather's mother was sent to a boarding school in Canada because she was from New Brunswick. And since my great grandmother has passed away, the last years of her life, she had really bad Alzheimer's, and she kind of reverted back to before she was sent to the school when she was 5. And so the very minimal amount of Penobscot and a little bit of Micmac that I know or understand is from when I was 6, when she was at that point in her life. But my grandmother, she was an infant, so she has no recollection, she has no knowledge, and she kind of disregards the fact that she's dark skinned, dark hair, dark brown eyes, while her siblings are light skinned, blue eyes, blonde hair, and she's like, oh yeah, I'm a little bit different than them, but it was kind of whispers, it's yeah, she was actually adopted. But for me, it's she doesn't really acknowledge that. I feel because she was one of the lucky ones. My grandmother grew up with a kind family, and a lot of siblings. She didn't really have, it was never really acknowledged that she was Native, but it wasn't, she just never knew from the get-go, I guess. But for me, it's always kind of been my generation, and even my dad, we didn't quite fit in. I'm stuck between this, my family doesn't acknowledge it, but I want to, but it's hard to vouch for my own identity when I don't have that sort of that ancestral line, that there's that lack of cultural trickle down to me, that everything that I know is just from my own ambition. In college, I started I'm pursuing Indigenous studies. I'm actually starting Orno this fall. But yeah, I just don't know if you would have any advice for someone that's in my position where I mean, the Malayaca Day was kind of a thing that spoke to me because I remember when I was really little, I wanted to like write the essay and be Malayaca, but I remember my great grandmother in her little like, scooter saying it's like she told me to not put myself on a stage for being Native because people would know, is what she said. And she told me that the celebration wasn't exactly for us, it was for the people who want to dress Indian when it's convenient, but when it's inconvenient, they don't have to deal with it. I just don't know if like any of you have any advice for someone that like I didn't go through it personally as like my grandmother and my great grandmother, but it's still kind of transferred down to me that it's like grasping at something that's like just out of reach, that it's like I should be able to get there, but I can't quite, and I feel bad like I don't know, like embracing like my own identity because it's like I came here with my mom and my sister, and which is great because like my mom didn't used to acknowledge like that side of us, but it's like me and my sister have always kind of been this outlier group somehow.
So I encourage you to connect with the Native Student Organization when you go to UMaine at Orono in the Wabanaki Center. There's a Wabanaki Center there on campus. And become involved and connect with them. My mind goes to tuition waiver. There's a tuition waiver for Native students at University of Maine system schools, and you don't have to even student who's a tribal member or whose parent or grandparent was a tribal member. So if there's any way that you can get documentation of your grandmother being a tribal member, you could get tuition waiver
We've really
at the university.
me and my grandfather have been trying. We think it would be hard for my grandmother just because we don't know anything. But for my great grandmother, like our problem is we don't know how to get the records, and she was given a different name, and she wouldn't say her real she wouldn't say the name she was given originally. So it's been a lot of a struggle because that documentation isn't very easily accessible for us.
I know we have to wrap up, so I'll make this quick, but you met Sandy Whitehawk in the film, one of the Truth Commissioners. And Sandy created a national organization that exists for people like you. The goal is to welcome you back into the community that you were disconnected from because of this cross-generational severance that boarding schools and residential schools imposed on families. It's called the National Indian
It's the First Nation Repatriation Institute. Yeah, she developed a beautiful welcome home ceremony for adoptees that they have been doing in tribal gatherings and where she is in Minnesota. And she does also a lot of work with adoptive parents and adoptees and caseworkers. But I would just, April might want to say something, but I would just encourage you to connect with Native people when you're up at UMaine, go to Indian Island. There's always something going on. Because, and get around the drum. If you can get around the drum, if you can take a Wabanaki language class from Roger Paul while you're there.
I'm taking a language class this fall, and at my first college that I was at, we had like a independent guided study, and it was like learning language on your own, and I don't even know how I managed it, but like I connected with Gabe Paul, and like he gave me a lot of like curriculum stuff, so like I started to kind of brush up on it.
You know what to do. Holy, those are exactly all the things you should be doing. Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. So I know we have to wrap up. The only thing I would say to you is claim your space. You are just as valid as all of the rest of us. Your journey and your path is just as valid. And so while you can't
trace a direct line back to, the specific tribe or the specific land, your journey is just as important. So I think you're doing all of the right steps. One of the things I am currently a part of is Team Indigenous Roller Derby. And so we are the first all-Indigenous women's roller derby team globally. And so we have tribal members from all over the world. And when we get together, we have to meet by video conferencing because we have people that are in New Zealand, we have people that are in Canada, we have people here in the US. But what we've heard as part of this journey is there are so many different stories. We have people who have grown up on their tribal lands, they speak the language, they know all the ceremonies, and we have others that, their dad was Native and their mom wasn't, and their dad left when they were born. So they have no connection to their tribe, but they know that those are their people, they just don't know how to make that journey. And so even though it's sports and it's fun, it's been one step towards connecting to that community of other Indigenous people. So as I said, up at UMaine, connect to the student government, connect to other natives, go to gatherings, and you'll start to see some familiar faces. You'll start to make some connections and some friends. And I know down in Portland, we're starting one with Portland schools where we're having a gathering for all of the Native families so that they have some way to connect. Come down and see us. We'd be happy to have you. Welcome. We're excited you're back.